We would like to send out a special thanks to our new sponsor, Wink, for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Wink is offering our audience members who are over 21 and live in the U.S. a $22 credit plus free shipping on their first order of 4 bottles of wine as a new member of Wink. So please visit trywink.com/cold. That's trywinc.com/cold. Thank you and enjoy the show. October 24th, 1961. Lincoln, Massachusetts. 30-year-old housewife and mother Joan Risch vanishes from her home, and the evidence at the scene suggests a violent abduction. Witnesses report seeing a bloody, disoriented woman matching Joan's description walking down the road that day, but this woman is never found. Investigators eventually uncover evidence to suggest that Joan might have decided to stage her own disappearance, causing debate about whether she was really attacked or took off voluntarily. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we are going to be featuring one of this podcast's most requested missing persons cases, the 1961 disappearance of Joan Risch. I've had quite a few people ask that I cover this one, including a listener named Stacy and another listener named Alan, who made a post about the case in our Facebook discussion group, and the responses clearly indicated that this was in high demand for the show. There's a lot of fascination with this story because it's hard to come up with a concrete solution about what happened. On one hand, the evidence strongly suggests that Joan Risch was the victim of a violent abduction. On the other hand, what if she staged the whole thing and disappeared voluntarily to start a new life? In most missing persons cases, that theory would be completely ridiculous, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility here, as it would have been easier to pull off something like that 56 years ago. There's another popular theory which has been pushed forward by online sleuths in recent years, but I'm going to explore this disappearance from all possible angles. However, before we get started, just a brief reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes like this one and shorter minisodes. We deliver either a new full-length episode or a new minisode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please take a moment to leave us a rating or review, because that will help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on the website. If there's anyone out there who wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout out on a future episode. And if you have a few moments, we would greatly appreciate it if you could fill out a survey for one of our sponsors. This survey will give them an idea about what type of audience listens to our show and would prove very helpful. You can find links to this survey on our Facebook and Twitter pages, but you can also fill it out by visiting the website podcastlistener.com/cold. That's podcastlistener.com/cold. Thank you very much in advance for your time and your support. So with all that out of the way, let us now examine the baffling disappearance of Joan Risch. Our story begins in 1961 in the small town of Lincoln, Massachusetts. Our central figure is 30-year-old Joan Risch, a homemaker who lives with her husband Martin and 2 children, 4-year-old Lillian and 2-year-old David. In April of that year, the family had moved to Lincoln from Ridgefield, Connecticut. Martin works as an executive for the Fitchburg Paper Company, and while Joan has a degree in English literature and had previously worked as an editorial assistant at some publishing companies, she has put her career on hold to stay home and take care of her children. On October 24th, Martin left town to go on a business trip to New York City. After a routine morning taking her daughter to the dentist and running some errands, Joan returned home for the afternoon, putting David down for a nap while the Risch's neighbor, Barbara Barker, brought her 4-year-old son Douglas over to the house to play with Lillian. At around 1:55 p.m., Joan took the 2 children across the street to the Barker residence to play in the yard and told them she would be back. About 20 minutes later, Barbara glanced across the street through her kitchen window and saw Joan running up the driveway beside her car. She was wearing a trench coat, had her arms outstretched, and appeared to be carrying something red. Since trees were blocking her view, Barbara did not get a good glimpse of the situation, and would later say she assumed Joan was chasing after her son David while he was dressed in a red jacket. However, this would turn out to be the last confirmed sighting of Joan Risch. Barbara took Lillian back to her house at around 3:40 so she could take her own kids shopping. Even though Barbara did not see Joan, her car was still parked in the driveway, so she assumed Joan was still there and watched Lillian walk back into her house. But after Barbara returned from her shopping trip 35 minutes later, Lillian came up to her and said, "Mommy is gone, and the kitchen is covered with red paint." Barbara went over to the Risch house to check things out, and discovered that the red paint was actually blood smears, and the kitchen was a very disturbing scene. There was blood on the floor, and someone had made an attempt to clean it up using paper towels and a pair of David's coveralls. In addition to the blood, the telephone had been ripped out of the wall and placed inside a wastebasket, which usually would have been kept underneath the sink. The telephone book was open and was at the section containing the emergency numbers. There was also an overturned table. Barbara immediately went upstairs to check on David, who was still in his crib, but crying because his diaper needed to be changed. However, there were also traces of blood in David's room, the master bedroom, and the stairway, and a blood trail which led outside from the kitchen to the driveway. The trail stopped at Joan's car, and there appeared to be some blood drops on the outside of the vehicle, including the fender and the trunk. Oddly, there was also a coat hanger resting on top of the car. Since there was no sign of Joan, Barbara immediately contacted the police, who arrived at the house to examine the scene. By this point, the blood had dried, but oddly, even though it could be found throughout the house, there was no sign of any bloody footprints, and investigators were unable to determine which location the bleeding would have started at. It would turn out the blood was type O, which matched Joan's blood type, but the total amount of blood found only turned out to be half a pint's worth, so it could have been caused by a superficial, non-fatal wound. There was also a bloody thumbprint on the phone mount, along with 2 fingerprints and a partial palm print on the kitchen wall. Since Joan's prints were not on file anywhere, these prints could not be ruled out as being hers, but as time went on, investigators did eventually uncover a record of Joan's fingerprints, and they did not match the prints from the kitchen, which have never been identified. Martin Risch was informed about his wife's disappearance and immediately flew back home. Of course, given that he was in New York City the entire day, Martin had an airtight alibi, and by all accounts, there were no issues with the Risch's marriage, so he was immediately cleared of any involvement. But he was able to point out an odd piece of evidence in the kitchen's wastebasket. There was an empty liquor bottle in there, and Martin confirmed that he and Joan had drank from it and thrown it out the night before. However, there were also some beer bottles in there, and Martin did not recall anyone in the house drinking beer since guests had visited the previous weekend. Anyway, before Joan's disappearance, a milkman, postman, and dry cleaner had visited the house earlier that day. They were all interviewed by police and cleared of any involvement, and none of them remembered seeing anything unusual. Interestingly enough, the dry cleaner picked up some of Martin's suits, and if he had dropped one of his coat hangers while leaving, this could have provided a potential explanation for the hanger found on the roof of Joan's car. There was also an interesting account from Virginia Keene, the daughter of the Risch's next-door neighbors. While returning home from school at 3:25 that afternoon, Virginia remembered seeing a dirty blue sedan parked in the Risch's driveway. Her account was corroborated by another witness who remembered seeing a blue sedan back out of one of the driveways on that street a few minutes later. Martin claimed he did not know anyone who drove a car of that description. Since the blood trail from the Risch house had come to an abrupt end in the driveway, This seemed to imply that Joan had left in another vehicle, so could she have been abducted by whoever was driving that blue sedan? Well, there turned out to be another strange complication. Once Joan's disappearance was featured in the media, eyewitness reports started coming in from motorists who remembered seeing a woman matching Joan's description on the afternoon she went missing. In all these sightings, the woman had a kerchief over her head and wore clothing which was similar to the clothes Joan was last seen wearing. The first of these sightings took place on Route 2A at approximately 2:45 p.m., about a half hour after Joan was last seen by Barbara Barker. The other sightings took place on Route 128 between 3:15 and 3:30, and the last time she was seen was around 4:25. She was described as looking disoriented and appeared to be hunched over and clutching her stomach as she walked. Most disturbingly, the witnesses thought they saw blood on the woman's legs, but no one actually pulled over to help her, and she was never found. Police checked local hospitals, but could find no record of Joan or any other injured woman matching her description. This led to speculation that Joan might have been attacked in her home and suffered a serious head injury which caused her to develop amnesia and wander off from her home. There was also the possibility that there was no violent attack, and that Joan suffered some sort of episode which caused her to trash her house and walk away, but she had no known history of mental illness. Another complicating factor was that Route 128 was under heavy construction at the time. If that woman was Joan, what if she had fallen into one of the excavation pits at the construction site and was unknowingly buried when the pit was filled in? Well, the investigation went nowhere for over a year, until a much stranger explanation for Joan's disappearance suddenly emerged. About 16 months after Joan went missing, a local reporter named Serene Gerson was looking through a library book about the mysterious disappearance of the 27th wife of Brigham Young, who was the polygamous former president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and had a total of 55 wives in his lifetime. Gerson noticed that Joan Risch's signature was on the book's checkout card and dated September 16, 1961. While browsing the stacks, Gerson then noticed that Joan's name was also on the checkout card for a book titled Into Thin Air, which told the story of a woman who vanished and left nothing behind but a towel and blood smears. Well, this piqued Gerson's curiosity, and after she wrote about her discovery in the newspaper, the library committee started checking through their records and discovered that Joan had checked out over 25 library books during the summer of 1961, which dealt with murders and unexplained disappearances, and some of these books involved people disappearing voluntarily. Martin Risch did not seem to find this unusual, and claimed that his wife just really liked reading suspense stories, but this caused some people to theorize that Joan was reading these books to help dream up ideas about how to stage her own disappearance. There was speculation that Joan might have become resentful about the fact that she had to give up her career in the publishing industry in order to become a stay-at-home mom, and just wanted to go off and start a new life somewhere. However, many people who knew Joan stated that she was incredibly devoted to her husband and children, and happier than she'd ever been at the time she went missing. While there were unconfirmed sightings of Joan over the years, as there are in pretty much every missing persons case, no hard evidence was ever found to suggest she was still alive. This caused quite a sensation when it originally happened, but since the investigation failed to turn up any tangible leads, it eventually faded from the spotlight. Martin Risch continued to raise his children, but never declared his wife legally dead, and passed away in 2009. Interest in the case has been rejuvenated in recent years by online sleuths, as it has become a popular mystery to discuss on message boards and forums. But in spite of this, there are still no answers about what actually happened to Joan Risch. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a moment to tell you about our new sponsor, Wink, as we are very excited that they are fans of the show. We often share some very creepy and intense stories on this podcast, so sipping a nice glass of wine while you listen to us would be the ideal way to help you relax. Wink is targeting a new generation of wine drinkers who want to do away with the pretense and simply enjoy reasonably priced, great wine. Wink custom tailors wines to the taste of the individual consumer and delivers 3 bottles of wine each month to your doorstep for $39 plus a flat $6 shipping rate. When you visit Wink and take their 20-second palate profile quiz, you'll get instant wine recommendations based on your unique profile. The price point for most wines is $13, so by signing up with Wink, you are getting your first bottle for free. Wink is offering our audience members who are over 21 and live in the US a $20 credit plus free shipping on your first order of 4 bottles of wine as a new member of Wink. Your wine delivery will be branded Wink. Wink is the wine club associated with Wink. Tonight, I enjoyed a nice 2016 bottle of Funk Zone White Blend. Funk Zone was produced from grapes in California's Santa Barbara County. It is a textured flavored of aromatic stone fruit with floral notes, plus crisp acidity and a pop of citrus. It's ideal to serve chilled at dinner, particularly if your main course is fish, shellfish, or sushi. Wink's website recommended this wine to me after I took their quiz, and the recommendation was right on the money. And because I ordered from them, I also have 3 other bottles of wine which are just as good. Like I said earlier, this particular brand of wine would be an ideal companion for you while listening to this podcast. So to receive a $20 credit and free shipping on 4 bottles of wine on your first order, go to trywink.com/cold. That's trywink.com/cold. trywinc.com/cold. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this episode. So it's easy to see why this has been one of the most requested cold cases to feature on the podcast, as nothing about this story makes complete sense. It's actually very reminiscent of the episode I did about the disappearance of Mary Shotwell Little 2 months ago. Both cases involve a woman going missing under bizarre circumstances during the 1960s, and both victims would be spotted by eyewitnesses looking disoriented with blood on their legs. If you try to put the pieces of the puzzle together and figure out what happened to either of these women, nothing quite fits. On the surface, Joan Risch's disappearance should be a simple case of a woman being violently abducted from her home, but you can't ignore the key pieces of evidence which seem to point away from that direction. Even though this case is nearly 56 years old now, I think one of the reasons it has been so heavily discussed in recent years is because it has some interesting parallels with 2 prominent movies which have been released during the past decade. The first one is Gone Girl, the 2014 David Fincher-directed film starring Ben Affleck and Rosamund Pike, which is based on a best-selling novel by Gillian Flynn. And if you haven't seen it, I'm going to issue a massive spoiler alert right now. Anyway, the plot involves a housewife named Amy Dunn, who goes missing under suspicious circumstances, and all the evidence seems to suggest that she was killed by her husband. But then it turns out that Amy orchestrated her own elaborate disappearance and set things up so that her husband would take the fall for her murder, which never actually happened. Now, of course, that definitely isn't the case with Joan Risch, since she went missing on a day her husband was out of town and had an airtight alibi. However, when you watch Gone Girl and see Amy Dunn doing all this research and careful planning to stage her disappearance, you can't help but think of Joan. Amy stages a violent abduction scene inside her house and leaves traces of her own blood behind to make it look like foul play. While traces of blood were found in Joan's house, it was not enough to suggest she'd suffered a fatal injury, so could she have cut herself and then staged her own abduction? Well, I'm not sure many people would have jumped to that conclusion if not for the fact that Joan had checked out so many books from the library about murders and disappearances, some of which told stories of people disappearing on their own. And it must be said that if something like this happened today, it might not raise as many red flags. There's a running joke among true crime buffs that if you ever turned up missing, one can only imagine what sort of conclusions people would jump to after checking your browser history. And that is a very valid point. If we want to read up on unsolved murders and disappearances today, we can pull those things up online in a split second. But in the pre-internet world of 1961, the only way Joan could read up on something like that would be to check out a bunch of books from the library. Joan's husband never bought the idea that she disappeared voluntarily and just said that she was really interested in suspense stories, which is a pretty reasonable explanation. If we didn't have the internet at our disposal today, how many of us might check out 25 true crime books over the course of one summer without raising any red flags? While many people who knew Joan maintained that she was devoted to her children and never would have abandoned them, it's certainly possible that could have just been a facade. Joan did say she planned to go into teaching once her children got older, but she could have been secretly embittered about having to give up her career in order to raise them. I guess now would be a good time to discuss some pieces of information about Joan's childhood. When she was only 9 years old, both of Joan's parents died in a suspicious house fire, and she was adopted and raised by her aunt and uncle. And Joan apparently also told people that she was sexually abused as a child. You will often see these points mentioned in many accounts of this case, but I'm not sure how much relevance they have to her disappearance. I guess you could assume that Joan started the fire which killed her parents and was mentally unbalanced enough to orchestrate her own disappearance, but since there are no specific details available about these incidents from her childhood, we can't really speculate about them. Now, the biggest complicating factor here are the eyewitness sightings of the woman resembling Joan walking down the road on the afternoon of her disappearance. If that was Joan, how does this fit into the staged disappearance theory? If she wanted to make everyone believe she had been abducted from her house, why would she let herself be seen walking around in public like that? The witnesses claimed the woman looked disoriented and had blood on her legs, so I guess Joan could have been faking the whole thing for show, but I don't see what purpose that would serve. Another thing which seems to go against the idea of Joan disappearing voluntarily is the fact that she left her pocketbook behind at the house, and it turned out she would have had no more than $10 in her bank account at that time. Unless Joan was secretly stashing money somewhere that no one knew about, she didn't exactly have many resources at her disposal to start a new life. As far as I'm concerned, there are two key pieces of evidence which show that someone else was likely in the Risch's home on the afternoon of her disappearance: the sightings of the blue sedan in the driveway, and the unidentified fingerprints and palm print found in the kitchen. Now, what's odd about the sightings of the sedan is that in a 1996 article published in the Boston Globe, it stated that the police later determined that what the witnesses probably saw was an unmarked police cruiser. Well, I haven't seen this piece of info mentioned anywhere else, but are they implying that the witnesses got their times wrong and that they actually saw the vehicle in the driveway after the police had already arrived? I guess that might make sense for the second witness who saw the vehicle, but the problem is that the first witness, Virginia Keene, said she saw the blue sedan while she was arriving home from school at 3:25. Given that kids usually arrive home from school at the same time every day, I don't think she would have gotten the time wrong, especially since the police wouldn't have arrived at the Risch's house until shortly before 5 o'clock. So I'm going to go under the assumption that the blue sedan was not a police cruiser and that an unknown person's vehicle was parked in the Risch's driveway that afternoon. Now, if there's one thing about the scene inside the house which does look staged, it's the fact that the phone was found in the wastebasket in the middle of the kitchen floor, even though the wastebasket was ordinarily kept under the sink. That is unusual, but doesn't change the fact that there were multiple unidentified fingerprints in the kitchen and a bloody thumbprint. If you believe Joan disappeared voluntarily, I guess it's possible she could have enlisted an accomplice to help her stage the abduction scene before this person drove her away in the blue sedan and they went off to start a new life together. It's not completely impossible, but of all the theories presented, I'm inclined to think the staged disappearance is one of the most far-fetched. So now we're going to move into a theory which has become quite popular among people who've discussed this case in recent years, that Joan's disappearance was the result of a botched abortion. As you probably know, abortion was illegal in 1961, so what if Joan had gotten pregnant, and when she attempted to get rid of the child, things went horribly wrong? Now, the one thing you have to keep in mind is that there has never been any talk about pregnancy or abortion in any of the articles or official documentation related to the case, and there is no concrete evidence to support this theory. It's all pure speculation from people who have studied this case, but I do acknowledge that since abortion was such a taboo subject in 1961, it might not have crossed people's minds at that time, and this idea has only emerged through looking at the case from a modern perspective. I mentioned earlier that 2 modern movies seem to have influenced discussion about this case. One of them is Gone Girl, but I believe the impetus of the abortion theory is the 2008 film Revolutionary Road, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet as an unhappy married couple from the 1950s. Winslet plays a restless housewife who had to abandon her career aspirations in order to raise her children, and her plans for a fresh start for her family are derailed by an unplanned pregnancy. Winslet then attempts to perform a self-induced abortion inside her home, but winds up dying due to complications. So one cannot help but picture a similar scenario for Joan Risch, where she winds up having an unplanned pregnancy and attempts to get rid of her unborn child. It's possible Joan decided to hide this pregnancy from her husband because she knew he wouldn't approve of an abortion, or perhaps her pregnancy was the result of a secret affair nobody knew about. In fact, another possibility is that Joan didn't even know she was pregnant until she suddenly suffered a miscarriage that afternoon. If Joan was planning an abortion, she might have arranged for a doctor to visit her home while Martin was away in order to perform the procedure. But then complications arose, causing Joan to lose blood, become disoriented, and wander away from her home. This would account for the alleged eyewitness sightings of her, where she had blood on her legs and appeared to be clutching her stomach. Now, this scenario wouldn't account for why Joan's body was never found, but I suppose we can harken back to the explanation that she fell into one of the excavation pits on Route 128 and was unknowingly buried by a construction crew. I also think this abortion theory picked up a lot of steam when people saw the original crime scene photos and noticed the coat hanger lying on the roof of Joan's car in the driveway, as coat hangers were often used back then to perform illegal abortions. And yes, that is a pretty weird item to find in that location, and the only alternate explanation I've seen offered is that the dry cleaner might have left it there by mistake when he visited the house and picked up Martin's suits earlier that day. There are a few details which would seem to support the abortion scenario. For starters, it's always struck me as odd that Joan took Lillian and Douglas across the street to the Barker house and left the children to play in the yard without any explanation. From what I can tell, Joan never even went up to Barbara to tell her she dropped the kids there, so you get the impression that Joan really didn't want the children at her house for the next little while. It was only 20 minutes later when Barbara saw Joan walking up the driveway, where she appeared to be carrying something red in her arms. Yes, you could probably infer this was a fetus, but I think there would have been a lot more blood in the driveway if that was the case. But if Joan was planning to perform a vacuum aspiration abortion on herself, it's also possible the red thing could have been some sort of tube or suction device. If you've seen Kate Winslet's abortion scene in Revolutionary Road, you'll see that she used a red balloon-like object to perform the procedure, so maybe Barbara saw something like that. Or perhaps Joan did attempt to use the coat hanger to perform her abortion, but after she started losing blood and became disoriented, she stumbled out of the house and left the hanger on top of her car. However, if an attempted abortion did take place, the presence of the unidentified fingerprints and the sighting of the blue sedan would suggest that Joan might have summoned a doctor to her home to perform the procedure. Remember, the phone book in the kitchen was open to the emergency numbers section because these were the days before 911. If something had gone wrong and Joan was bleeding, she might have attempted to call for help, but the doctor prevented this by ripping the phone from the wall, as this abortion attempt would have gotten him into some serious legal trouble. The doctor could have taken Joan out of the house in his blue sedan and either killed her or waited for her to die of complications and disposed of her body somewhere. Or he could have just fled the scene in panic and Joan wandered out of the house on her own after a failed attempt to clean up the blood in the kitchen. But there are time issues with this theory, as the first sighting of the woman resembling Joan took place at 2:45, and the blue sedan was seen in the driveway after 3:25. If the sighting is accurate, and that woman was Joan, then I don't know why a doctor, or anyone else for that matter, would still be hanging around the house nearly an hour after Joan left. I guess it's possible a doctor might have been the one to make the failed attempt to clean up the blood in the kitchen. While there was quite a bit of blood found throughout the house, they were mostly smears rather than large pools. In total, it was about a half a pint's worth of blood, and seemed more likely to have been caused by a superficial wound. If Joan had suffered through a botched abortion attempt or a miscarriage, there probably would have been a lot more blood at the scene. Also, illegal abortions from that time period were often referred to as back alley abortions for a reason. In other words, If a woman wanted an abortion, it's unlikely she would have gotten one from a doctor visiting her house in the suburbs on a weekday afternoon. Joan was watching over her 2 kids and in frequent contact with her neighbor across the street, so it just seems awfully risky that she'd invite someone over to her home to perform an abortion on this particular day. I know Joan dropped her daughter off at the Barker home, but there was always a chance that Lillian could have returned, or Barbara could have brought her back home while the procedure was still taking place. If Joan needed an abortion that badly, it just seems more logical that she would have left her kids with Barbara and then gone elsewhere to do it. Once again, the biggest issue with the abortion theory is that it's all pure speculation and there isn't any hard evidence to back it up. So now let's examine the possibility that Joan was abducted from her home and was a victim of foul play. It could have been an intruder, but it's also possible that someone Joan knew was coming over to the house that afternoon, which would explain why she suddenly took her daughter across the street to play in the Barker's yard. Well, it's now time to talk about another wild theory. If you go to Joan Risch's Wikipedia page, the first cited source is a PDF file containing a lot of original documents from the case, including newspaper articles and actual police reports. This was put together by a group called New England's Untold Stories, who did extensive research into the case and apparently re-interviewed some of the people involved. They outline a scenario where a male intruder entered the house during the morning while Joan was taking her daughter to the dentist. When Joan returned, the intruder couldn't sneak out in time without her noticing, so he was forced to hide somewhere inside the house. That afternoon, Joan sensed someone else might be there, so for their own safety, she took Lillian and Douglas over to the Barker's yard before she checked into it. When Joan went back into the house, she crossed paths with the intruder, who subsequently murdered her and took her body away. But here's the really weird part. The implication seems to be that the perpetrator was Barbara Barker's husband, William Barker. This PDF file contained maps of a tract of land in the nearby town of Lexington, which happened to be owned by the Barkers. So I guess this is where Joan's remains might have been buried. Yeah, okay, if you're looking for some context for this, or an explanation for why William Barker might have broken into the Risch home and murdered Joan, they don't provide one. If you look at the official documents and articles about this case, there is no mention of William Barker anywhere. I know nothing at all about William, so I can't speculate why he would break into his neighbor's home in the middle of the day and then kill Joan once she discovered him. In fact, the documents don't actually state that William was the intruder, but since they refer to land he owned as Joan's burial site, that's the implication they seem to be making. I have a lot of issues with this theory, but one of the biggest ones is the sightings of the blue sedan. Martin Risch specifically stated that he didn't know anyone who owned a vehicle of that description, which he probably wouldn't have said if his neighbor across the street owned one. So until I hear any specific evidence pointing to William, I'm going to hold back on pinning the crime on him. But that's not to say that Joan couldn't have fallen victim to an unknown third party. The blood trail, the phone ripped from the wall, and the fingerprints in the kitchen lend credence to the idea of Joan being attacked by an intruder, possibly in her upstairs bedroom. She attempts to phone for help, but the attacker runs into the kitchen and rips the phone out of the wall. Joan then runs out of the house into the driveway, makes it to her car, but the killer catches Joan, puts her into his own vehicle, and then subsequently flees the scene before he murders her at another location and disposes of her body. Let's assume that Joan might have been having an affair with another man. Since her husband is out of town, she invites this man over to her house shortly after 2 p.m., which is why she took Lillian and Douglas over to the Barker house. If she had a guest and they drank some beer together, that might explain why bottles were found in the wastebasket. I'm not entirely sure these beer bottles have any significance here, since Martin said they had guests over at the house who drank beer on the weekend. Since October 24th was a Tuesday, it's possible Joan simply hadn't emptied the bottles from the wastebasket yet. But if not, inviting a guest over that afternoon would explain where those beer bottles came from. If the affair theory were true, maybe Joan was attempting to break things off with this man, and he reacted badly. Or maybe there was no affair, and Joan resisted another man's advances, causing him to turn violent. However, to construct a timeline for this scenario, you still have to discount either the eyewitness sightings of Joan or the sightings of the blue sedan in the driveway. The first sighting of Joan took place on Route 2A at 2:45, yet the sighting of the sedan took place at 3:25. I guess one innocent explanation is that the sedan has no relevance to this case, and that whoever was driving it might have just stopped at the Risch home after Joan was gone and left when no one answered the door. If it was, say, a traveling door-to-door salesman with no connection to the Risches, they might not have come forward to say that they were there because they didn't even hear about Joan's disappearance. Now, the eyewitness sightings of Joan are the major wild card in this case, and I've already thought there was something really off about them. All these witnesses claim they saw a disoriented-looking woman who looked like she was in pain and had blood on her legs, yet none of them stopped and offered to help. There's always a lot of reason to be skeptical about the accuracy of eyewitness sightings, but I can't overlook the fact that multiple people provided a very similar story. If it was only one person sharing this story, I might be inclined to think they made it up. But at least 3 different witnesses described a similar-looking woman seen at different times. I guess it's possible that they saw an entirely different woman who wasn't Joan, even though there were enough compelling similarities to suggest it was her. I also wouldn't discount the possibility that Joan did suffer a violent attack at her home, in which the attacker left her for dead, but she survived. This might explain why an intruder would make an attempt to clean up the blood in the kitchen before fleeing the scene. However, the attack could have caused Joan to suffer a serious head injury, which caused her to become disoriented and forget who she was. This woman was seen wearing a kerchief, so if she did have a head injury, it would have been covered up. But if that woman was Joan, what happened to her? Once again, there's the possibility that she fell into one of the excavation pits and was buried, but I think this whole case would fit together so much more neatly if the witnesses were mistaken and did not actually see Joan. While I do think the staged disappearance and abortion gone wrong theories are compelling, I ultimately believe that in the overall scheme of things, the foul play theory just fits the facts better. I couldn't tell you who the perpetrator was, or if it really could have been William Barker, but if you ignore the outside evidence, such as the eyewitness sightings and the library books, and just focus on the evidence inside the house, it suggests that Joan had a violent struggle with an unknown individual who injured her and caused her to lose some blood before they abducted her from the scene in their own vehicle. If the blue sedan did belong to the perpetrator, then I don't believe they were anyone whom Joan's family or friends would have been familiar with, because otherwise, it should have been easy to track down the owner of that vehicle. This is one of those mysteries where I might be able to come up with a concrete theory if I had some more pieces of information, mostly about some of the conclusions reached by New England's untold stories, but for now, I'll just go with the abduction and murder scenario. Yet this case is so strange that if there was another explanation for what really happened, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised. It's definitely ranked right up there among the mysteries I'd most love to learn the full explanation about. Anyway, in spite of all the time which has passed, the disappearance of Joan Risch is technically still an active investigation, so if you have any information which might help solve this case, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own theory about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. And before we close things off, I'd like to play a promo for another great true crime podcast which did its own episode about the Joan Risch case earlier this year. Here's Lainey from True Crime Fan Club.
Hey guys, it's Lainey, host of the True Crime Fan Club podcast. If you're a true crime addict like I am, then my podcast is for you. It's a podcast for the ultimate true crime enthusiast, giving you a glimpse into the life and crimes of the most demented minds. You won't want to miss an episode.
So a big thanks to all my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thank you to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. We also have a Facebook discussion group about The Trail Went Cold, in which myself and my listeners hang out to discuss the podcast, the featured cases, and true crime in general, so feel free to join anytime, and I'll approve your request ASAP. And And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. Anyway, we're about to enter the month of October, so you can expect to hear a slew of Halloween-themed cases over the next few weeks. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for our first Halloween-themed minisode of The Trail Went Cold.